Let me say this right at the start. If you think this is just another military photo, just another bomber headline, just another flex from Washington that will disappear by tomorrow morning, you are missing the real story. Because this is not about one plane. It is not even just about one country. It is about what happens when the United States decides it wants a message delivered without firing a shot that day, and chooses one of the most recognizable symbols of American air power to do it. And if you understand that, then you understand why people in Tehran do not look at a B-52 the way the average viewer does. They do not see a photograph. They see a warning, a timeline, a capability, a reminder. And right now, in the middle of a war that has already shaken the region, already battered the energy market, already dragged Washington deeper in, and already pushed diplomacy to the edge, that kind of reminder hits differently, because this is not peacetime signaling. This is wartime signaling. Reuters published a photo this month showing a U.S. Air Force B-52 Stratofortress departing RAF Fairford in Britain on April 7th, loaded with munitions in the context of the U.S.-Israeli conflict with Iran. That matters not because one photo proves an attack is imminent, but because it confirms something much bigger. The U.S. wants its long-range bomber posture to be seen, and when Washington wants a bomber posture to be seen, that is never random. Now here is where people get this wrong. A lot of coverage turns every bomber movement into one of two lazy narratives. Either war is about to start tomorrow, or this is meaningless theater. But neither of those is good analysis. The truth sits in the middle, and it is more dangerous there, because the real function of a bomber signal like this is not always immediate attack. Sometimes it is to widen the menu of credible options. Sometimes it is to force the other side to think about hardened sites, command centers, missile depots, leadership movement, air defense readiness, and whether the next round of diplomacy is happening under the shadow of greater U.S. reach than before. That is how deterrence works when it is no longer abstract. And right now, the U.S.-Iran crisis is not abstract at all. According to AP, President Trump has extended the ceasefire with Iran indefinitely at Pakistan's request, but the United States is still maintaining a naval blockade on Iranian ports and coastal areas. Iran, meanwhile, has hesitated to return fully to talks, while that blockade remains in place. That means we are not looking at a stable peace. We are looking at a pressured pause with military pressure still very much alive in the background. That is exactly the kind of environment where bomber signaling becomes more meaningful, not less, because Tehran does not evaluate those bombers in isolation. It evaluates them in context. And the context is ugly. Iran has already been hit hard in this war. AP reports that the conflict has consumed major U.S. and allied munitions, driven a push for sharply higher Pentagon spending on drones, missile defense, and strike capability, and reinforced how central the Iran conflict has become to U.S. force planning. That tells you the United States is not behaving like a country that thinks this crisis is winding down neatly. It is behaving like a country preparing for sustained confrontation risk. Now ask yourself, what does a visible B-52 signal mean to Iran's leadership under those conditions? It means Washington is reminding Tehran that pressure is not just naval, not just diplomatic, not just economic. It is airborne, persistent, flexible, and designed to keep Iranian decision-makers guessing. That last point matters the most. The real value of strategic bombers in a crisis like this is not simply what they can carry. It is what they force the other side to imagine. Imagine command nodes being targeted. Imagine missile infrastructure revisited. Imagine broader retaliation if the ceasefire collapses. Imagine the U.S. deciding it no longer wants to rely on narrow pressure alone. And once the imagination of the defender starts running ahead of the facts, the signal has already begun to work. That is why I would be careful with the phrase panic mode. I cannot verify panic, but I can verify pressure. I can verify uncertainty. And I can verify that U.S. military signaling has remained active while diplomacy has stayed fragile. Now here is the contradiction at the center of this entire moment. Publicly, every side still wants to talk about diplomacy. Privately, every side is still trying to maximize leverage before diplomacy hardens into terms. The United States wants Iran back at the table, but under pressure. Iran wants talks, but not under humiliation. Pakistan wants to preserve the mediation track, and China wants de-escalation, open shipping lanes, and no regional meltdown that wrecks energy flows. That means no one is operating from a position of relaxed confidence. Everyone is operating from calculation, and strategic bombers are instruments of calculation. They are not subtle. They are not cheap. They are not deployed for aesthetics. They are deployed because they change how the other side prices risk. For a U.S. audience, here's the simplest way to think about it. A B-52 in this kind of crisis is not just a plane. It is a sentence that says we still have range, we still have options, we still have escalation capacity. And if you thought the ceasefire or the talks meant the military shadow had lifted, think again. That is why Tehran pays attention. And the reason this lands so hard now is because the broader situation remains unstable on multiple fronts. AP reported that Hezbollah and Israel have continued exchanging fire despite ceasefire arrangements, while Reuters and AP have both described ongoing uncertainty around the US-Iran diplomatic track. So this is not one contained negotiation with clear edges. It is a live regional crisis with several connected flashpoints. In that environment, the psychological effect of a bomber signal gets amplified, because Iran's leaders are not just thinking about Washington. They are thinking about Israel, about Hezbollah, about maritime pressure, about domestic legitimacy after months of war, about whether showing flexibility now looks prudent or weak, about whether the US is really pausing or simply repositioning, and that is where visible air power starts to matter even more than the hardware itself. Now, let's talk specifically about the B-52, because it carries a particular political weight that people often underestimate. The B-52 is not new. It is not stealthy. It is not the sleek, futuristic symbol that dominates Hollywood war imagery, and that is exactly why it can be so unnerving, because it represents something older and more brutal: volume, reach, persistence, and the memory of American campaigns where overwhelming air power became the language through which Washington made its seriousness unmistakable. Iranian officials know that history. Iranian commanders know that history. And whatever internal debates are happening in Tehran right now, they are happening with that memory in the room. So no, I will not tell you the B-52 photo means bombs are falling tomorrow. That would be sloppy. But I will tell you this: when a conflict is active, when diplomacy is shaky, when a naval blockade is still in place, when U.S. force posture is visibly active, and when the world is still watching Iran's response, these bomber signals stop being routine military background noise. They become part of the negotiation, part of the pressure, part of the architecture of the crisis itself. And there is one more reason this matters. It tells us something about Washington's mindset. If the White House believed the ceasefire was durable, if it believed the diplomatic track had clearly stabilized, if it believed Tehran was essentially boxed in and out of options, the visible need for strategic reminders would be lower. But that is not the picture we are getting. Instead, AP reports the ceasefire has been extended while key coercive tools remain in place. Reuters has shown visible bomber imagery in the conflict environment, and the Pentagon is already arguing for major increases in the kinds of munitions and systems this war has consumed. That is not post-crisis behavior. That is contingency behavior. That is the behavior of a government that still thinks this could go several different ways and wants those ways shaped by U.S. strength rather than U.S. hesitation. Now, from Tehran's point of view, that creates a dangerous dilemma. If Iran ignores the signal, it risks underestimating Washington. If it overreacts to the signal, it risks handing Washington a pretext for even more pressure. If it returns to talks too quickly, domestic hardliners may frame that as surrender under threat. If it stalls too long, it may discover that the military and economic pressure architecture only gets tighter. That is not panic. That is strategic confinement. And sometimes strategic confinement is more dangerous than panic because panic is chaotic. Confinement is disciplined, cold, relentless, and capable of producing bad decisions precisely because every available option starts to look costly. That is what bomber signaling helps create. A feeling inside the target state that the box is still there and maybe getting smaller. Now here is where the US audience should really pay attention. The reason this matters is not simply because Iran is America's adversary in this conflict. It matters because these kinds of signals can either stabilize a crisis or harden it. They stabilize it if the other side decides the risks of escalation are now too high. They harden it if the other side concludes it must show defiance before its bargaining position erodes further. And right now, we do not yet know which direction this goes. That is the whole point. If this were settled, the bomber message would not feel so heavy. If this were resolved, the region would not still be living under blockade politics, fragile ceasefires, Hezbollah flare-ups, and emergency military budgeting. If this were truly under control, the visible grammar of U.S. power would not need to keep speaking so loudly. So what should you take away from this? Not the cartoon version, not war tomorrow, not panic in Tehran as a verified fact, not just a photo. Take away this. The B-52 signal means Washington wants Tehran to know that the military shadow over this crisis is still real. It means diplomacy is happening under coercive conditions, not above them. It means the US is still shaping the psychological battlefield, not just the physical one. And it means Iran's leaders are being forced to make decisions while staring at a reminder of how much American power can still be brought to bear if this spirals again. That is the real story, not panic as spectacle, pressure as structure. And in some ways, that is more serious. Because spectacle fades, structure remains, a viral headline burns hot for one day. A bomber posture can change calculations for weeks. And right now, in this crisis, calculations are everything. Iran is calculating whether delay helps or hurts. The US is calculating how to keep pressure high without triggering uncontrolled escalation. Israel is calculating whether the current pause is real or temporary. Pakistan is calculating whether mediation can still hold. China is calculating how to protect energy flows and regional stability without overcommitting publicly. And above all of that, the bombers are there as a reminder that while diplomacy may still be speaking, force has not left the room. That is why Tehran notices. That is why Washington wanted it noticed. And that is why this moment matters more than it may look at first glance. Because the scariest signals in a war are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes they are the ones that say, very calmly, we are still here, we are still ready, and your next move is not happening in a vacuum.